the subject I've chosen is the soul in ancient philosophy, modern cognitive science. And I want to begin by reminding you all that the soul is one of the oldest and most widely used metaphors of humanity. And let me just list some of the meanings. If you look up soul in the dictionary, you get a whole host of meanings. And let me just remind you of a few of those meanings and illustrate them with turns of phrases that we all know very well. So the soul can be understood as an immaterial essence, as contrasted with the body. In fact, we speak of body and soul. We speak of the windows of the soul of my youth. To bear one's soul. We say that something is good for the soul. We speak of soulmates. So an immaterial essence. We also use the word soul for a person's total self instead of saying a person. If we want to be more poetic, we can say a beautiful soul. She's a beautiful soul. Or we can commiserate with somebody and say, oh, the poor soul. We can use it in terms of the inhabitants of a town of 500 souls. This all is sort of poetic language. More specifically, it can refer to a person's emotional nature, heart and soul. I love you with all my soul. Or in the religious sense, a person's spiritual essence. Lord, save our souls. And many expressions in religions that use the word soul in that sense. We can use it as a spiritual or moral force. A brave soul. We speak of the fortitude of the soul. Or we can use it as in the sense of an animating leader or an animating force. He was the soul of the party. We can use it as the essence of something, and I found 3 quotations from literature. Shakespeare, brevity is the soul of wit. Edgar Allan Poe, horror is the soul of the plot. Leonardo da Vinci, who wrote about the soul of painting, and so on. And finally, more recently, it has come to mean an essential characteristic of African American culture. We speak of soul food, soul sister or soul brother. I remember in the 60s reading the famous book by Eldridge Cleaver, Soul on Ice. So that's all used by a specific ethnic group. So now let me briefly review the history of the concept of the soul in Western philosophy. In early Greek philosophy, the soul was conceived as the ultimate moving force, as the source of all life. And its principal metaphor was that of the breath of life. In fact, the root meaning of both the Greek psyche and the Latin anima, both words for soul, the root meaning is breath, the breath of life. Now, closely associated with that moving force, with the breath of life that leaves the body at death, was the idea of knowing. For the early Greek philosophers, the soul was both the source of movement and life, and that which perceives and knows. For example, Anaxagoras in the 5th century BC called the soul nous, spelled N-O-U-S, which is Greek for reason. And he saw it as a world-moving, rational substance. And by the way, derivatives of this Greek word nous are noetic, the Greek term for intellectual, paranoia, which literally means beside reason, as well as metanoia, a term used with great frequency and fondness by R.D. Laing, who used metanoia in the sense of a change of mind or a change of heart. Now, a key element of the Greek worldview was the analogy between macrocosm and microcosm, and in particular between the earth and the human body. It was articulated most eloquently by Plato in the 4th century BC, but it can also be found in teachings of the Pythagoreans and earlier schools of philosophy. Because of this fundamental analogy between macro and microcosm, the individual soul was thought to be part of the force that animates the entire universe, the world soul, a universal process of knowing. So Plato called it the anima mundi. And of course, Plato did not speak Latin but Greek, but it's usually cited as anima mundi. I looked up the Greek original, which is psyche kosmo, so psyche and cosmos, the world soul. For Aristotle, the soul is the source not only of bodily motion, but also of the body's formation. It is the form that realizes itself in the changes and movements of the organic body. Aristotle conceived the soul as being built up in several levels, corresponding to the levels of organic life. So at the first level, we have the vegetative soul, which controls, as we would say today, the changes in the body's metabolism. The soul of plants would be restricted to this metabolic level of a vital force. The next higher form is the animal soul, which for Aristotle is characterized by autonomous motion in space and by sensation, the feelings of pleasure and pain. And beyond the animal soul comes the human soul, but these levels of soul always include the previous levels. So the human soul includes the vegetable and animal souls, but its main characteristic is reason. So that was Aristotle's scheme of the three levels of the soul. Later on, during the period of Hellenistic Roman philosophy, following the classical Greek period, philosophers gradually separated the two characteristics that had been united in the Greek conception of the soul, that of the vital force of life and that of the activity of consciousness. So side by side with the soul that animates the body, now appears spirit as an independent principle expressing the essence of the individual and also the divine personality. The Alexandrian philosophers introduced the triple division of the human being into body, soul, and spirit. but the boundaries between soul and spirit were fluid. The soul was situated vaguely somewhere between the two extremes, matter and spirit. Then, during the Middle Ages, the idea of spirit as a disembodied divine principle became the dominant theme of religious metaphysics, and the soul accordingly was seen as independent from the body and endowed with immortality. However, in the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci disregarded the teachings of the Church and adopted the integrated view of the soul that was held by Aristotle and the Greek philosophers. And scholars believe that this may be the reason why Leonardo never published his scientific work, because it went against the teachings of the Church. So he viewed the soul both as the agent of perception and knowing, and as the force underlying the body's formation and movements. In fact, Leonardo's writings about the soul are the reason why I personally got interested in that subject. I had always shied away from it, but with Leonardo, I got interested in this whole idea of the soul. So he did adopt the classical Greek idea, and especially the Aristotelian idea of the soul. But unlike Greek philosophers, Leonardo da Vinci did not just speculate about the nature of the soul, but tested the ancient views empirically. In his delicate dissections of the brain and the nervous system, he traced the sensory perceptions from the initial impressions on the sense organs, especially the eye, through the sensory nerves to the center of the brain. And he also followed the nerve impulses for voluntary movement from the brain down the spinal cord and through the peripheral motor nerves out to the muscles, tendons, and bones. And he illustrated all that, these pathways, in precise and beautiful anatomical drawings. From his thorough investigations of the brain and the nervous system, Leonardo concluded that the soul evaluates sensory impressions and transfers them to memory, and that it is also the origin of voluntary bodily movement, which he associated with reason and judgment. In Leonardo's view, all material bodily movements originate in the immaterial and invisible movements of the soul. Here's what he writes: spiritual movement flowing through the limbs of sentient animals broadens their muscles. Thus broadened, these muscles become shortened and draw back the tendons that are connected to them. This is the origin of force in the human limbs. Material movement arises from the immaterial. With this concept of the soul, Leonardo expanded the traditional Aristotelian idea according to his empirical evidence, and in this he was far ahead of his time. During the subsequent centuries, Leonardo's notebooks remained hidden in ancient European libraries, and many of them were lost. And the integrated Aristotelian view of the soul gradually disappeared from philosophy. The idea of the soul as immortal and divine and of spirit as a separate entity became the dominant themes of theology, while for other philosophers, the concept of the soul became increasingly synonymous with that of the rational mind. In the 17th century, finally, René Descartes postulated the fundamental division of reality into two independent and separate realms, that of mind, which he called the thinking thing, res cogitans in Latin, and that of matter, the extended thing, res extensa. This conceptual split between mind and matter has haunted Western science and philosophy for more than 300 years. Following Descartes, scientists and philosophers continue to think of the mind as some intangible entity, and they were unable to imagine how this thinking thing could relate to the body. In particular, the exact relationship between mind and brain is still a mystery to most psychologists and neuroscientists today. Well, during the last 2 decades of the 20th century, a novel conception of the mind and of consciousness emerged in the life sciences, which finally overcomes the Cartesian division between mind and body. The decisive advance has been to reject the view of mind as a thing, this Cartesian notion, and to realize that mind and consciousness are not things, but processes. In the past 25 years, the study of mind from this new perspective has blossomed into a rich interdisciplinary field known as cognitive science, which transcends the traditional frameworks of biology, psychology, and epistemology. One of the central insights of this new cognitive science is the identification of cognition, the process of knowing, with the very process of life. Cognition, according to this view, is the organizing activity of living systems at all levels of life. So accordingly, the interactions of a living organism, plant, animal, or human being, the interactions with the environment are understood as cognitive interactions. And so life and cognition become inseparably connected. Mind, or more accurately, mental activity, is immanent in matter at all levels of life. This new conception of cognition, or mind, if you wish, represents a radical expansion of this concept. In the new view, cognition involves the entire process of life, including perception, emotion, and behavior, and does not even necessarily require a brain and a nervous system. So every living organism is a cognitive system, and as the biological complexity increases in evolution, so does the complexity of the corresponding cognitive processes. So the relationship between mind and body is always a relationship between process and biological structure. Now, the main difference between Leonardo da Vinci's concept of the soul and modern cognitive science seems to be that Leonardo gave the human soul a specific location in the brain. Today we know that consciousness is a widely distributed phenomenon, a process involving complex layers of neural networks. Now, of course, Leonardo da Vinci did not have access to this level of microscopic structures, nor did he know any chemistry or electromagnetism, so he could not perceive the electromagnetic signals of neurons and so on. So he had no way of exploring this extended network of neurons. And since he observed that the pathways of various sensory nerves seem to converge toward the center of the brain, so he decided that that is the location of the soul. Body and soul formed one indivisible whole for Leonardo. The soul desires to stay with its body, he wrote, because without the organic instruments of that body, it can neither carry out nor feel anything. Again, this is completely consistent with modern cognitive science, where we have come to understand the relationship between mind and body as one between process and structure, cognitive process and living structure, two complementary aspects of the phenomenon of life. Indeed, as Leonardo wrote of the soul, so cognitive scientists today speak of the mind as being fundamentally embodied. On the one hand, cognitive processes continually shape our bodily forms, and on the other hand, the very structure of reason arises from our bodies and brains. So in conclusion, it seems to me that the modern scientific concept of cognition, although very different from the dualistic Cartesian idea of soul, comes very close to the integrated view of the soul held in early Greek philosophy and in the science of Leonardo da Vinci. As I mentioned before, in my life as a scientist, I always stayed away from the term soul because I associated it with the Christian idea of an immortal divine essence. But since studying the integrated view of Leonardo da Vinci and of early Greek philosophy, I've become comfortable in associating the soul with cognition. As I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, in our everyday language, the soul is understood as an immaterial essence or animating principle. That is certainly true for cognition as the process of life. The soul is also seen as a person's total self, the total process of life, and as one's emotional nature, which is also an important part of the modern concept of cognition. So I feel very much at ease now about the term cognition as the modern equivalent of the ancient concept of the soul. So I will end here, and I'm very curious to hear how it sounds to you.
Thank you, Fritjof. That was wonderful. I will. So now we're open for questions and comments, and I'll try to keep an eye on all of you who raised your hand. And if you write a comment, I'll call on you. Oh, Daniel, I see. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, let me ask a practical question. In terms of psychoanalysis and therapy, does it really matter how you conceptualize soul or cognition? How would it practically affect, improving your behavior, improving, dealing with your problems? Some of them are existential, but it really, in the long run, doesn't seem to matter what you make of the soul.
Well, of course, I have no experience as a therapist. I have some experience of psychotherapy as a patient, but none as a therapist. But it would seem to me that it would make a difference whether we see, mind or the soul or cognition as one side of the same coin and material structure as the other side, the relation being one between process and structure, and neither one being able to exist with another, rather than seeing mind or cognition or the soul as a separate entity. It would seem to me to make a difference, but concretely, I have no idea, and I will invite others who are working therapists maybe to comment on that.
Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, I don't know how to get that cute little hand on the screen. Well, I think it's a really interesting question. There doesn't seem to be any history of the term soul used in certainly in psychoanalysis, but thinking metaphorically, as at the beginning of Fritjof's talk, all these amazing ways that we have of heart and soul, the soul, not the literal religious take on it, but maybe more to do with the essence, of a person. I suppose the notion of authenticity might be, which is a pivotal concept in existential philosophy and psychotherapy, might come closest to it. But I think it's a very interesting question. It might be more in use for religious counselors, who always bring, usually they're Christian, who merge religion and therapy as one thing. But I haven't seen it used in a secular context other than just strictly metaphorical.
Yeah, it's interesting, Michael, that for those of us who don't subscribe to the Christian religious concept of the soul, these phrases that I cited at the beginning, nevertheless, it seems have a strong emotional resonance. I mean, if I say to somebody, I love you with all my soul, I'm saying something, and if she or he would say, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by the soul? Mm-hmm. We have difficulty in explaining it, but emotionally, we definitely relate to it.
Yeah, I was just thinking about those lists that you came up with, Fritjof, at the beginning. And, there's actually a couple of songs I can think of that are actually titled Heart and Soul. Giving someone your heart and your soul. But it also reminded me of this famous passage in one of Bob Dylan's songs. I gave her my heart, but she wanted my soul.
Yeah.
And I thought that was an interesting, typical Dylan-esque site. What do you make of that? That they're not identical, but separate.
Yeah, and on the other hand, Rod Stewart had a song, My Heart and My Soul.
My Heart and Soul, yes. Yeah. Well, they use them both, so maybe they're not synonymous, but two sides of, of the coin. I think in Dylan's usage, there's a part of oneself that always is separate. And that's not to be bargained with or taken. So maybe that in that context, that remains part of oneself.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's interesting play.
Well, in terms of the modern concept of cognition, you would say that emotion is part of cognition, but it's not all there is.
Mm-hmm.
So the heart would be part of the soul, but the soul is much more.
Yeah, good point. I love the talk, by the way. This is an amazing, thought-provoking topic. Sure.
Oh, Australia.
Yeah. Thank you, Fritjof. It was really
Welcome.
great. My camera is, I will try to make it on, but I have no energy now. So I have a candle here.
Have personal energy, but no electric energy, right?
Yes. So yes, I'm using 4G now, no Wi-Fi here.
Yeah.
So I love your talk. Thank you very much, Fritjof. I was wondering about the biological structure and cognition or soul, as it was wonderful, the way you did to arrive at cognition as soul, the interaction between them. Do you think the cognition could change or modify the biological structure, or the biological structure could change cognition or soul? How do they interact?
They interact in the sense that biological structure, this is quite complex, and it would take me a long time to get really into these concepts and theories. But basically, biological structure is not static. It is a dynamic structure, and it is a biological system self-organizes, and the very essence of this self-organization is continual regeneration. So every cell, every organism, every ecosystem, life itself continually regenerates itself. And this self-organization in terms of continual regeneration is essentially a cognitive process. That's the basic idea. So yes, cognition does change biological structure, and they have mutual influence. So they're two sides of the same coin.
Oh, Stephen. Oh, sorry, Estrella, did you want to say
Oh,
something?
thank you. Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Stephen, go ahead.
Oh, hi, this was just a fantastic talk. I've been interested in this
thank you.
subject for a long time. And I was reminded, and I just looked it up, this Bruno Bettelheim New Yorker piece from 1982, Reflections about the mistranslation of Freud from the German into the English. And where Bettelheim says that James Strachey consistently translated die Seele, which I don't know German, but
Seele, yeah.
Seele, soul, as the mind.
Uh-huh.
And so Freud himself used this word in the German consistently, and when it was translated into English, it was turned into mind, and it really distorted, I believe, a lot of the metaphoric, the connotations that we're talking about right here.
Yeah, I mean, the same may be true of Descartes, because Descartes saw the soul as very rational, but I believe, I seem to remember some writings or drawings, sketches of Descartes, where he also put in soul instead of mind.
Well, that's really interesting. I just want to piggyback on what Stephen just mentioned. Of course, now I remember Bettelheim's book about that. I think, of course, what did Freud mean in invoking that specific term? A lot of Freud's terminology was much more personal and heartfelt than what Strachey was comfortable with. He really wanted to make psychoanalysis sound very scientific in the English language. And you can still get a sense, despite the language, that Freud is not quite as mechanistic as people like to assume. But that reminded me of the German word Geist, which is sometimes translated as mind. But Hegel's famous work, Phenomenology of Spirit, is how he meant it to be, not phenomenology of mind. Do you have any thoughts, Fritjof, about spirit and soul? how those are related.
Yeah, well, as I said in my talk, it's very interesting to follow the history from the early Greeks to the Hellenistic philosophers to the theologians of the Middle Ages, where spirit is slowly introduced as a separate entity. And for Aristotle and Plato, they had apparently no notion of spirit. It was all included in the soul.
So they're synonymous then, spirit and soul.
Yes, yes.
Okay, okay.
But, and again, you know, the root meaning is breath. Both the Latin spiritus and the Latin anima are related to breath.
Hmm. And I see John's hand is up, and I'd like to make a comment or question after that. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was really stimulating. The first comment I wanted to make is that to reply to do people, meaning psychoanalysts, refer to soul? And I think it's important to point out that Jung and the post-Jungians constantly are referring to soul, and particularly reinstated by Hillman and his followers. And we also have a very distinguished Jungian here, which is Ladson Hinton. I hope I don't embarrass him, but I'm sure he has a lot to say about that. The second is the notion that, coming back to this dualism that seems to be present in history of philosophy, Descartes commonly misunderstood, because he really didn't have a radical dualism, ontological dualism. When he talks in his meditations and when he talks in his letters, he's constantly reinforcing the notion that mind and body, or soul and embodiment, are a unit, and that they're only categorically distinct. But we see this commonly misrepresented in your basic introductory to philosophy textbooks, and it's uncritically metabolized by other disciplines. So I think, to speak of one without the other is really difficult, even way back then, like whether it be Aristotle, whether it be Descartes, whether it be Kant, even. But I think people get hung up by the notion of the immortality or the immateriality of the soul, and this is where we're all kind of in the same boat together. We have to decide for ourselves what we feel comfortable with here. But with the turn to neuroscience or the cognitive sciences, there is a tendency for an ontological reductionism in the way we think about our minds, body, whatever you want to call it, to the point that, we live in a society where everything is kind of looked at as brain, the age of the brain. And so all we need to do is manipulate our nervous system with medications that will be a panacea to our psychological sufferings. When, that's hard for me to buy. And some new developments in philosophy of mind are there's two forms, in my opinion. You've got the revisitation of Spinozian notion of dual aspect monism. So you have a whole, different aspects. And then you've got a new trend, which is really an old one, and it is the notion of a panpsychism or a cosmopsychism that situates consciousness within the whole cosmos. And of course, we're just a differentiation of it, to the point that there's some very interesting work being done in philosophy of mind by David Chalmers, for instance, but also in some Jungian studies, that are interesting in and of themselves, which I've been involved in. But this also reminds me, and I wanted to ask Fritjof as a physicist, what do you think of Alfred North Whitehead and the notion of, of looking at the universe as, as consciousness, or as a process of consciousness? And also that you can extend this to Hegel's notion of spirit, because he really introduces the notion of spirit as being cognition.
Yeah, I think, John, Whitehead certainly is very much in consistent with this new notion in cognitive science as cognition as a process. His whole philosophy is known as a process philosophy. And so I don't know enough about Hegel to comment on that, but I want to pick up on something you said a little while before, that the notion of spirit or soul as an immaterial entity is somehow mysterious. And that is true. That has been mysterious, for centuries. But once you recognize it and identify it as a process, it's not mysterious at all, because a process is not material. A process is the activity of matter. It cannot happen without matter, nor can biological matter exist without the corresponding cognitive processes. So that relationship between process and structure, to me, is a real advance in knowledge.
So I wanted to jump in with another question, and then I see Daniel and Meg, both of you. Just that I was, as you've been talking about the soul as cognition, and this type of cognition that seems to be, part of, like, the heart is part of it, and it's maybe also relational. I was thinking of Heidegger's work on what is called thinking, and maybe this is a question to some degree to Fritjof and also to Michael and John or whoever else is familiar. But I was just, wondering about the connection between these ideas about Heidegger's idea of being, and how what is called thinking, brings this whole discussion of the soul as cognition into this maybe idea of what calls for thinking, what in the world calls for thinking, what an experience calls for, it calls you out into it. And perhaps one of the practical applications of this whole idea of the soul as cognition is that what is essentially us is relational, and it gets called forth into the world. And I guess I had in mind Daniel's original question, what might be practical about all of this, that what is most essentially us is this relational type of being and thinking that's always being called forth, and we have to embrace that.
Well, James, I don't know nearly enough about Heidegger to comment on that, but maybe Michael can say something about that.
Well, what my mind went to this comment of Heidegger's about the body. Some philosophers said he neglects to bring the body into his discussion of being, and actually Heidegger said there is no body separate from mind and spirit. So to talk about mind and body as though they are two separate things that have a relationship is part of the problem. So he was very uncomfortable talking, even bringing the word body into play. he assumes it's always there. And it was Merleau-Ponty who then shifted the focus of phenomenology to explicitly about the body, but this time the body is always embodied with consciousness and spirit and so on.
Mhm.
So that's where my mind went, James, when you brought in Heidegger in this
Mhm.
discussion.
Because being unites it already. It's
It
not,
unites everything. There is no mind and body separate. So it's hard to even talk about mind and body, because as soon as you do that, you're separating.
yeah.
And that would also mean that being is a continuing process. Does that
Mm.
come out in
Yes.
Heidegger's work?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, I always think of Heidegger when you talk Fritjof. um, Daniel, I see. Yeah, if you want to
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, I think there's some background noise I hear. Some people are not muted. But
Yes.
I like your idea of cognition and as a process, because in reality, there's some background noise here. In reality, there's no, I don't think Aristotle, by creating the soul, helps us understand anything better, or I don't know how much it explains. And so we get hung up on the concept of soul and spirit, and is it a useful concept? But one of the things that it comes to mind is that our language and culture lags behind our development of ideas. So once you use cognition as a process, I don't have to worry about what soul means anymore. I'm trying to understand, behavior. I'm trying, today we might use different terms like mindfulness, which is more an idea of, think of the present and not the past and the future, and how you attack certain problems and how you analyze problems. And you don't have to use all these concepts, but we're still stuck in culturally and language, which is well behind. For example, the heart as a metaphor goes back to Aristotle. What does the heart have to do with how I won a baseball game? The winning team had heart, heart and soul. It's so meaningless, but we know what they mean. Hey, they tried hard, etc. So I don't know how useful these metaphors are. And I'll give you one more example. Let's say I'm an atheist, and I still say, oh God, right? I don't know how many times I say that word. I can't escape the language, which is lagging so far on some ideas. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of getting away from these ideas and thinking of cognition as a process interacting with bodily function, which I think is very useful and directs us into more meaningful questions, research, and ideas.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you that language is often lagging behind. And, when we have new insights, or when we revive some old ancient insights, we need to share this and share our experience of these ideas for language to change. Because language is something that we share. It's a collective characteristic of cognition at the human level. We communicate with language. We are embedded in language. Umberto Maturana says we are continually languaging. We have a languaging network in which we interact. And once these new ideas and new experiences are shared, then the language also changes.
I like that term, languaging. That's good. I never heard that before.
Yeah.
So next we have Meg. Yeah. And sorry, Meg, I muted you earlier because there was background noise. So go ahead and unmute.
Okay.
All right.
I the idea of flow, and flow going from the brain down the spine and into every muscle and every nerve, and this being a continual process of flowing, to me fits beautifully with family therapy, because I think it's really important to know that the movements and the spirit and the way that one is affects relationship in terms of the next person or a group of people or a society. And it spreads out and it has an effect. And I believe that Fritjof spoke to that with a phrase earlier, in which there's a flow that's taking place that involves everything about an entity, in this case called a human being. Right now, Finn's movements are going to affect my movements. My movements are going to affect the people around me. And in difficult situations, in my experience as a family therapist, it is pretty simple to know part of what is going on, a great deal of what is actually happening in a group, by simply watching the movements of each person in relationship to the others. I don't have to have a lot of words in that case. Frequently, the words are going to be a cover-up. That's my experience. And the words are going to be a cover-up, but actually the movements that people are making in relationship to each other are very meaningful and affect each other. And they're going to also affect whoever that group encounters. We really are not all that separate, in my view. And it seems pretty simple to see when you put together a family or you put together a group of people and watch what is happening movement-wise.
Yeah, Meg, I think what you point out, that these systemic concepts that I have presented, that they correspond to your experience in family therapy, I think that's not a coincidence, because systems thinking in the social domain has decisively been influenced by family therapists. In the history of systemic thinking, they played a huge role, especially I remember there was a school, or Warsaw is a school in Italy, in Milano, of family therapy. You probably know the names of the people, I forgot them, but they have been a big influence.
I have forgotten the names too, Fritjof.
We're all getting old.
But I do know about the Milano group, and
Yeah.
certainly those of you who had anything to do with living in groups in the houses in London must have been aware of how much movements some people made influenced other folks and their movements. I just think that's quite simple. And certainly in dance, if you don't use any words, dancers can convey extraordinary meaning and stories. And storytelling, I think storytelling is so powerful in terms of actual processes and the way people affect other people. And all beings affect. I mean, this redwood tree outside here and I have a relationship.
In fact, we should also mention that there is such a thing as movement therapy and even dance therapy.
Yes.
These are fields that exist. I remember in the 1970s, I had many discussions with dance and movement therapists, the school of Rudolf Laban and Irmgard Barteniev. They constructed a whole language to talk about movement, and was really interesting stuff.
Yes.
Okay.
Then you're next. Stephen, if you want to jump in. Oh, yeah.
So is it my turn or?
Yes, sorry,
Oh,
yes.
thank you,
So-
thank you. So just a couple of quick things. So I've been very interested for a long time in the concept of intersubjectivity. And I believe that that's also made its way into psychoanalytic theory. And I also think it's, you know, if you go back and read Freud, you find that the intersubjective nature of intimate relationships and how when we lose an object, we introject some of that. And I have this sense that, you know, that we, in our intimate relations, we exchange soul substance somehow. And then when we lose those relationships, we take some of that with us because our soul has been influenced by another soul. But the other thing I wanted to mention was going back to the Heidegger thing. Heidegger, and I'm certainly not a Heidegger scholar, but my sense is that when Heidegger talks about thinking, there's this idea of meditative thinking, that there's different types of thinking, right? And there's this kind of calculating rationality, the kind of left brain, let's figure out how we can dominate, a logic of domination of objects. And that Heidegger was inviting us to another way of thinking. And as we see sort of what's happening on the planet and all these crises that we're dealing with, it seems like we need to, there are many of us are in a process of soul searching, if you will, trying to dig deeper into a deeper forms of cognition, because the calculating rationality way of thinking is leading us to disaster. And so I really invite us to think about humanity soul searching right now, digging deeper within ourselves and maybe deeper layers of cognition so that we can come up with better ways of dealing with the crises that we face.
Yeah, thank you. That it's really, really important. Thank you for these comments. When you began to speak about intersubjectivity, somehow I was thinking of the spiritual teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who coined this term interbeing. And I never met him, and I have known about him for a very long time, but somehow never listened to him until recently, you know, after his death, actually. And recently I watched several videos. There are lots of videos around, and he's extremely impressive, just, you know, demonstrating what you said, you know, in a mindfulness context.
Michael.
Yeah, I could make just a comment, Stephen, to your you had two parts to your question, intersubjectivity and thinking. For the thinking, yes, you know, Heidegger, of all the Greeks, loved Aristotle the most. And he talks about meditative thinking and calculative thinking. You know, that we're all taught to think calculatively in school. You know, we think of academic thinking as calculative thinking, separate from meditative thinking. In a way, what we're doing right now is an exercise in meditative thinking. You know, we're pondering things, we're looking at them more metaphorically. But that goes back to Aristotle, who distinguished between calculative thinking and contemplative thinking. So really, that's a very old idea that kind of got lost in the history of Western philosophy. Heidegger even makes a comment that rationality is the enemy of thinking. So, you know, alluding to this other, more open way. But about intersubjectivity, which isn't really related to that specifically, the concept goes back to Husserl, And Heidegger was very unhappy with the concept of intersubjectivity for the same reason he wasn't very happy with the mind-body problem. Because when you talk about intersubjectivity, you're talking about a relationship between two subjects. For Heidegger, there is no subject. We're all out there in the world with each other. You can't separate yourself. And this is something I think Fritjof would definitely agree with. We're all process. It's artificial to think about self and other. It's another misleading distinction. So, but yes, you're right. Relational analysts in particular have really seized on the idea of intersubjectivity as though that's somehow some huge advance over the idea of interpersonal psychoanalysis. A lot of talk has been spent, fine-tuning that. I don't really see, the difference. But yes, it goes back to this misreading of Descartes. That there's only the mind and the body are completely separate, which isn't true, obviously.
As far as I remember from reading biographies of Descartes a long time ago in the 1970s and 1980s, Descartes was a very religious person, and he saw the connection between mind and body through God who created both. So he had this triangle of God and mind and body. And then, later on in science, God was dropped. And then you had this contrast, this Cartesian, so-called Cartesian division between mind and body.
Can you believe we've only been talking for about 25 minutes or so? Covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, I think this is a wonderful conversation with all the knowledge you guys have, and in philosophy and history of ideas. I'm really enjoying that.
James, I don't seem to have a raised hand function. Could I ask a question?
Sure. And then I see Booth after that. Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you. This is Denise. Yes, I was. I'm a student in psychology and a Bible student, actually. So my understanding of soul is definitely much more than cognitive processes, and that's what I wanted to ask about the say role of therapy and existential therapy, and about like who can work with whom, if the because the goals of a person who believes in that a soul is eternal, and that it's it has to do with your like these appetites, these passions, and we believe it has to be changed by God, actually, and stuff like that. And so can a person, so are there limits to who people with a certain philosophy can work with, or do people disclose to their clients, what they believe on these kind of things?
Well, I could take a stab at that question, Denise.
Okay.
Just from my own experience, I have run into some issues around that question. It seems to me the whole spirit of psychotherapy, at least from a psychoanalytic perspective, is to be open to learning things about yourself, and to be seeking answers to questions that you don't have the answers to. So that implies that a person to truly benefit from it shouldn't be too dogmatic, too certain about certain things. I have had an experience with a couple of people in my practice who were extremely religious and did believe that everything was related to God, etc. And it created a bit of a roadblock for us to really step outside of that and look at things maybe in a personal way that isn't always related to this religious dimension. But most people, of course, are not that. Despite being very God-fearing and religious, etc., are able to make that distinction, that not everything in the universe is necessarily a product of God's intention, and therefore you need to rely on God in order to have any kind of change in your life. Most people are more multifaceted, I think, than that.
Right. Yeah, glad, because I've had Christian counselor, and some of them are so like sort of spiritual, or like didn't visit my friend in hospital, quit me when I was suicidal, which even a secular ethical person wouldn't do. And so I found it very difficult, like to find emotionally, what would you call it? People who understand emotions within the faith community. And also then I found a lot of denial of faith, and not, respecting other people's belief within, mental health circles. So, that's, just been something I've had to deal with. But thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I once supervised a person who was, getting his license, and was very involved in a Christian church, and was going to be the church's counselor once he got licensed. And he said that when the preacher refers you to counseling for a particular marital problem, it's always assumed this is God's going to come into this discussion in a very fundamental way. This particular student wasn't so convinced of that, and felt that it was possible to do that kind of counseling that wasn't so narrowly situated. So I thought that was very interesting, that even within the church, there wasn't universal agreement about the role of God in in psychotherapy and personal pain, etc.
I found a lot of prejudice in the churches for people who are, like seeking treatment, say, and a lot of ignorance, and unfortunately, and yeah, it's very sad, very unbiblical, but it's very complicated. Anyway, thank you.
On the other hand, you have people like Stanley Levy, the late New Haven psychoanalyst, who was a close colleague of Hans Lowald. Stan was a Heideggerian thinker, scholar, a really extraordinary person, and unusual in how incredibly religious he was. He was born Jewish, converted to Christianity, and was a conscientious objector in World War II, which was very unusual, despite one's religious belief. And Stan kind of stood out in the psychoanalytic community as a religious believer. And a lot of analysts couldn't understand how you could reconcile being a person of faith and being a psychoanalyst, which they thought was as a completely atheist mindset. And Stan was able to be open to all of this stuff and not be.
What's his last name?
Levy, Leavy. He actually wrote a book called In the Image of God, which was a series of talks he gave to his church in New Haven. He was Episcopalian, that was integrating Christianity and psychoanalysis. And it's the most successful effort I've ever seen of talking about both Jesus Christ and Sigmund Freud, and how they were both saying the same thing. It's a very small book, beautifully written. If you can manage to find a copy of it in a library somewhere, it's really
I'm gonna look.
worth looking
Super.
at. Yeah.
Thank you.
Booth. I'll jump in.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Fritjof. That was fun. It's good to see you again, and Michael and all of you. I guess I'm riffing a bit off astray, trying to find this connection that between biological structure and the immaterial. You made, I believe you said, Fritjof, that Leonardo studied these limbs, traced the nervous system, and he discovered that spiritual movement was flowing through animal limbs. And you made the comment, I believe, that material movement arises from the immaterial, that Leonardo came to that decision. Is that correct?
Yes, but you need to know that what he called spiritual had no religious connotation. He used it in the sense of invisible, immaterial, invisible.
Right.
Because, you know,
my emphasis isn't on the religious or the spiritual, it's on the immaterial.
right.
And it's on your comment about process somehow bridged the gap for you in the new cognitive understanding.
Yes.
Because that bridged the gap of immateriality. But
The dark technique is so much better.
I'm wondering about how process does that for you. When I think of things like respiration or photosynthesis, those are processes, but
Yes.
they're material. They're not immaterial. When I think of sensation, I think it's very material.
Well, the processes involve matter, but they are not matter. They are the activity of matter. And the activity is not something material. It's not something you can measure and weigh, you know? You observe it as movement, as change. And it could not happen outside of matter. And biological matter is always in motion, is always in regeneration, in transformation. So it always involves process. They involve one another, but they're not the same.
Yeah, I think the etymology of process is movement, is moving forward, advancing.
Yeah.
But okay, I'll think about that a little bit.
All right.
Fritjof, could you comment on the notion of energy? Because maybe this might help.
Who was that? I don't.
John Mills.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, you know, energy in physics, which is my original field, is a quantitative measure of activity. It is always related. So it is related to process very much. But it measures the amount of process, the amount of activity. It does not say anything about the quality of the process. It does not say anything about the patterns of relationships that are involved in the process. So it is a quantitative expression.
Well,
so for instance, EMR striking our visual apparatus would be a process.
Yes.
And that is something we can measure up to a point.
Right.
So where's the immateriality in that?
Well, how should I say this? Okay. So imagine a sensory apparatus and the nervous system where there's no movement. You can analyze it in terms of its molecules in terms of its connectivity and all that. And you can put it on scales if you have very fine scales that can measure molecular weights. And you can say it weighs that much, and there are that many molecules, that many atoms that compose this structure. But that's very different from biological matter that constantly moves. And that constant motion is not expressed in the weight of the material or in the number of molecules. It's something else. It's something immaterial. I don't know whether that helps.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So shall we leave it at that? Leaving a little bit of mystery before we close.
This was really great, Fritjof. I really, this is such an interesting topic to play with and explore. I really loved it.
Yeah. And thank you so much, Fritjof. And thank all of you for coming.